uh, so saying first to people, thank you very much for your patience with all these technical problems, and that we are very, very happy to have here Thomas French, who is an associate professor in modern history in the College of International Relations at Ritsumeikan University. And he's a specialist on the occupation of Japan and peacetime military interactions between Japan and the West. And his broader research interests include the relations of the United States with Japan and the United Kingdom with Japan, the Japanese automotive and arms industry, and the Japanese self-defense forces. And he's the author of National Police Reserve, The Origin of Japan's Self-Defense Forces, that was published in 2014, and editor of the Economic and Business History of Occupied Japan, New Perspective, published in 2017 by Routledge. And I believe he's still currently leading the GSPES funded project, All Friends, New Partners, A History of Anglo-Japanese Peacetime Military Relations, 1864 to the present. And Thomas will be giving us the talk, and our discussant will be Professor Chris Aldous, that you know very well who he is. He's our big expert on everything that has to do with Japanese history. And as I said previously, I'm going to leave you momentarily to allow people that are in the other room to come to this one. So please go ahead, Thomas, with your talk.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. I know obviously we've attempted this a couple of times before, and because of COVID and various other things, it was impossible, but I'm really happy to be here, albeit here in Japan rather than there in Winchester. Again, very good memories of my time there, working through my PhD and again, working with Professor Aldous, etc. So yeah, really, hopefully this will be interesting for you, and it's certainly going to be hopefully a nice experience for me to travel down memory lane, as it were. So today I'm going to talk to you about Redcoats in Japan, or the Redcoats in Japan. So I look at one of the earlier elements that the JSPS project that I'm working on with various others, including Professor Aldous, is examining. So this is one of the first kind of peacetime modern military interactions between Japan, as it were, or the shogunate and the United Kingdom. So yeah, we'll look at the garrison, 1863 or circa 1863 to 1875. I'm not going to read through the abstract because that might be slightly boring, but again, photograph down here of it. It's meant to be the Marine Battalion, but it's other units as well, so Royal Artillery, the Belluccis and various others. But yeah, anyway, I'll talk through the historiography of the garrison, arrival timeline, some of the functions of the garrison, some of the impacts of it as well. So in terms of economic, social, cultural, other ones, political impacts on Japan. And then I'll talk about some of the more kind of social history elements of it. So the leisure and cultural activities of the garrison and their legacies in the country. And I'll move on to discuss the kind of core of this, some of the primary documents that, again, one of which certainly one of the most important ones hasn't been used before, and assess them as a kind of source for looking at this, presence in Japan and its kind of, I suppose, legacies and influence. So first of all, laying out a bit of the kind of historiographical background and studies thus far of this topic. There's not really any dedicated work on this, certainly in English. I mean, there are some, it's like an edited volume in Japanese and a sort of semi-academic work on it. I mean, the best work overall is produced in 1957 in Japanese, which shows its age in many ways. I mean, it's from the late 50s, but yeah, surprisingly for the various aspects that we'll look at and the influence that this force has, it really hasn't garnered much attention at all, especially in the English language scholarship. Ever since people started studying these topics in detail in kind of modern scholarship. So yeah, it's certainly neglected, something that really kind of, I think, deserves a lot more attention and a lot more stress on it. So hence the project. Reasons for its neglect? Well, there are various ones you could kind of point towards. So some of the diplomatic and economic history of the late shogunate period, early Meiji period get a lot of attention. So the treaty negotiations and economic development and things like that. But this doesn't. It's seen as like, if it's seen at all, it's like a footnote almost, like a functionary or a background aspect. Another factor is that the passive influences of this force are kind of, some of it's arguably more significant, or sort of secondary influences that it has, maybe you might say, are more significant. So it's maybe not so obvious unless you're really looking for them. Again, on the Japanese side, there's a language issues, of course. Analyzing lots of the aspects of this, require working and active knowledge and engagement in English with Victorian, often non-printed, handwritten sources. So this could be a challenge for some. Again, some sources are relatively obscure and inaccessible. Again, one of the approaches that I've done to this, which is uncovered again, this new source that I'll talk about, and others which I haven't brought into usage in this particular presentation, is going through regimental museums, other kind of not so central archives or sources of sources, as it were, and using those because there are, very, very interesting things around that really no one's aware of, or even what language they're in. They're seeing in the regimental museum, and is it Burmese, is it Chinese, is it whatever else? Again, it's sort of overlap Japanese, British military and social history, quite specialized, I suppose, in that sense. So, not so many people could work on it so effectively. Another issue too is that you're dealing with here on the British military side are kind of illiterate in terms of the men, the rank and file, and non-literary culture, more or less, for the officers. Very few of them read or write. I mean, we do have these accounts. There are another couple that exist that I'm in the process of acquiring, but it's not a group of people that produces, voluminous accounts day to day of what's going on, or even after the fact. So other significance, historiographical trends you could talk about. Again, there are similar topics that are being approached by people. So Fletcher on the Richardson murders, or Namamugi incident as it's termed, which overlaps to an extent with this. But there are other trends in the scholarship that this also sort of ties into or flows into. So looking at non-literate, non-elites within empire, and then, within imperial soldiering. Again, I'm hearing sounds here. Is that me being told to do something?
No, it's people that is being admitted by me that were in the lobby. Don't worry.
All right. My apologies. Yeah, I can only see my own slides. So, right. Yeah, where was I? So, social history, again, the sort of cultural influences of the force. So theatre, sports, music. Again, this ties into scholarship emerging these days on sort of imperial boredom, Auerbach, discussing the kind of the tedium of imperial administration or imperial presence of garrisons and things, and there's a lot of overlap here. Again, scholarship on occupied or frontier spaces, technology and knowledge transfer, and again, you're seeing a little bit of a revival and interest in publishing on particularly the early imperial Japanese military, which has some connections to this garrison. So the notable aspects, as I said, there's not really anything in English. I mean, there's a single master's thesis on this topic from the 90s from New Zealand. There's a little bit of work. Hamish Iron has done a chapter about the importance of Yokohama as like a military kind of node in Britain's Far Eastern policy, as it were. But that's not dedicated to this topic in particular. It's much more Royal Naval focused. So what I'm aiming for here with the broader project, not obviously I can't cover all this in this presentation, is a kind of fuller analysis. So something similar to that as I attempted with the National Police Reserve in that project. So the context, arrival, life, usage, influences, departure, legacies, interpretations of the force. Again, using primary sources, we're looking at some here, so semi-secondary and also primary, including, of course, many that are hitherto. Yeah, and again, looking at things from the garrison's perspective, and really kind of looking at the influence of the garrison directly rather than the garrison as kind of part of the negotiations and another thing. So, yeah, that's sort of carving out a little bit of the background in terms of the scholarship for you on the topic here. So again, I apologize, there's quite a few text-heavy slides here, but there's an awful lot of material I want to kind of get through. So arrival. Up until 1864, which is when these troops are sort of deployed, on and off landings and presence of Marines and, well, soldiers from different nations, again, Russians, various others, particularly in times of crisis or in times when there's been kind of violent incidents between the treaty port foreign population and the Japanese population. But you start to see a more fixed presence from 1862 in response to attacks on the British legation at Tozenji. There's a kind of Marine guard that's posted because they don't feel they can necessarily rely on the Japanese guards, because there's a kind of very serious attack that occurs, the first attack on Tozenji, where, you know, diplomats and others get very, very seriously injured and have to use their firearms to defend themselves. So, yeah, Marine guard is put on there. The context here of this, of course, is the Bakumatsu period into the Meiji period. So from around the mid sort of 1850s until the Meiji Restoration 1868, there's a high degree of instability inside of Japan. So expulsionary movement, the Joi movement, looking to get rid of the foreigners, keep them out, keep Japan closed, or at least closed for long enough in order to arm itself to keep the foreigners at length, or at least deal with them on more equal terms. And some of this resistance, some of this reaction to the presence and the encroachment, you might say, of imperial powers from the West expresses itself in attacks on foreigners. So the murders of Richardson, various others, again, attacks on foreign shipping. So leading to the bombardment of Kagoshima in 1863, the kind of Anglo-Satsuma War, as it's termed by some. Again, repeated calls from the foreign community in the emerging treaty ports, the largest and most important of which is Yokohama, for onshore permanent protection, as it were. 1863 to 4, UK and France assert their rights to defend the settlement in Yokohama and have troops present permanently. From 1863 through 1864, you start to see them arrive and establish themselves in two separate camps, a French camp and a British camp. The shogunate constructs barracks for them on the hill overlooking, or a hill overlooking the treaty port. So there's interpretations about how necessary this is, or the motivations behind it. Hora, one of the Japanese scholars who's worked on this topic, stresses the kind of commercial, it's almost like a Leninist argument that, commercial imperialist pressures are forcing the UK to do this. Perhaps more convincing is the kind of sense of persistent insecurity of the foreign community and the inability or unwillingness of the shogunate to deal with it. Again, the shogunate itself being forced into issue kind of edicts for the expulsion of foreigners. Again, you can talk about norms of 19th century international relations, making a presence here kind of necessary for prestige and other purposes as well. So timeline here, again, I'm not going to talk through this, various in detail anyway, various units rotate in and out, British and French, over the years, including one which becomes the Royal Hampshire Regiment, later the 67th Regiment. All the way through to 1875, where both the French and British units leave, as we'll come back to later. So these troops are actually used in different ways. So the active usage, the most obvious and the largest of which is the Shimonoseki campaign, or one of the bombardments or issues in Shimonoseki. They used on land to occupy some batteries, destroy them, and then they're involved in a kind of a brief skirmish, although again 2 Victoria Crosses are won during that, so it's a sharp one, as the contemporary accounts give it, against samurai units from Choshu domain, which is kind of trying to resist and expel the foreigners by bombarding shipping and others going through the Shimonoseki Straits. So they're used on land, they're used in this kind of brief campaign. They're also employed in various other incidents involving kind of violence against the foreign community, or attacks on the how should we say, British representative, particularly Parkes. Again, there's attempts to assassinate him, and they help protect him. Again, fighting using firearms in the process. They're involved in the Kobe incident, which is a kind of attack, or again, sort of skirmish that develops between some Japanese troops moving through the city and the newly landed foreign community in the opening port of Hyogo, which becomes Kobe. We're also involved in kind of patrolling and kind of fortifying to an extent the Yokohama Treaty Port for its defense. For passive roles, again, deterrence is one of the things that we can discuss or debate here, that they are put there in order into Yokohama to deter aggression, as it were, as it's seen, or potential attacks against the settlement in periods of instability. Again, Oslin talks about, quote unquote terrorism. Again, I don't think that term is particularly historically accurate. So historical, you could argue, for the mid 19th century in this context, but there to kind of prevent, or how should we say, minimize the risks of attacks on individuals. And paradoxically, members of both the French and British garrison themselves actually become targets and are murdered. But one of the rationales here is to protect the foreign trading community. They also operate as a kind of police force inside the settlement alongside the Japanese guards. They patrol the gates, patrol the settlement, they man the gates, etc. They also work as a kind of reserve fire brigade. So there's several major fires during this time in Yokohama, and they're deployed alongside the local Japanese fire brigades to help extinguish those, or demolish bits of the settlements to stop fire spreading and such. But again, there are instances of the troops involved in particularly one of the major fires looting some of the properties that are smashed or burning. So links to British strategy and policy. The garrison forms a key kind of potential tool, an actual tool, in fact, because it is used, but potential tool as well when it's not being used at the British legation. This image, by the way, is the Naval Brigade of Marines. The Marines form part of the garrison, of course, attacking this sort of stockade during the Shimonoseki campaign. So it forms kind of a tool of the British legation. Again, Gordon Daniels talked about the kind of quasi-military diplomacy that exists between the foreign powers and Japan, but the UK and Japan in particular. That said, Harry Parkes, again, the British minister in charge for most of the period that these forces are there, is reluctant to use them. And again, one of his predecessors, Neil, is actually kind of ordered not to use them, except in defensive operations. Unless you're attacked first, you cannot employ them against the Japanese. Again, there are other reasons why the presence of the forces here is useful for British strategy in the region. So prestige and trade concerns. Again, demands versus rivals. Again, the French presence makes it harder, arguably, some say, for Britain and France to withdraw these troops. They both have to go together, because one going before the other might be sort of embarrassing and sort of prestige loss or whatever else. So they leave at the same time, more or less. Again, paradoxically here, these forces are put in, you might say, because of shortcomings in the shogunate's ability to protect the settlement, but they sort of assist the shogunate while simultaneously undermining it, which is a bit interesting, some say. So their presence sort of irritates those who want to expel foreigners more and makes them question even more the shogunate's legitimacy and other things. But the presence there assists the shogunate in terms of having another force there to help protect the settlement, one which is kind of not, well, it's not Japanese, and it's there kind of as a independent actor. We can, how should we say, argue things away with, or use to say, oh, we can't do this, or we can't expel them because now they've got troops, etc. present. Again, helps prevent incidents, embarrassment, potentially greater intervention by kind of stabilizing matters. The presence of the troops also gives the British another card to be played in the negotiations with the shogunate and later on the Meiji government. So over withdrawal, we can keep them here until we're satisfied, and then or we'll extract more or whatever else from you that we want, and then we can withdraw, or we will permit our people to be withdrawn. Another factor here too that influences the British government is the sort of the financial, as it not value, but the economical nature of this. So the facilities they live in are constructed by the shogunate and maintained by them. It's seen as a kind of relatively healthy and safe place to keep troops in the region, as opposed to garrison in parts of China, which is seen as distinctly unhealthy. And the evidence suggests that, I mean, it's not wonderfully healthy in Japan, but it's certainly better than Shanghai and Hong Kong in certain times of the year, especially. But there are, again, cholera outbreaks, and there's a kind of endemic sexually transmitted infection, problem, as it were, amongst the troops and the population connected to their presence. Again, Morton argues this is one of the reasons why they're withdrawn ultimately, but yeah, it's seen as healthier, safer in a sense, and also cheaper. So it's a kind of preferred destination. And again, many of the garrison actually like being there more than they do in China. So on to the influences then, or other forms of influence of the garrison. So as I said, they don't really get a lot of attention in the scholarship, but they form the vast majority of the permanent, as it were, presence of foreigners, the population in the city, or in the treaty port of Yokohama. So up to 5 times the size of the rest of the foreign population, of the permanent or resident foreign population. Obviously, you've got large numbers of sailors, commercial and military coming in and out through the port, but yeah, the people who are there, consistently, vast number, the vast majority are members of this garrison and the French garrison. Again, the majority of the population, the foreign population, until at least 1871. So way through into the Meiji years. So that in itself is worthy of greater attention, the perspective of these guys who form up, the vast majority of the population who haven't really been studied at all so far. Certainly in English. On the other side of it, you also have, because of their size and influence, economic results from this. So Black, which is one of the main kind of sources people often refer to for this era, or kind of a record of events of this era, argues that their sort of presence results in security and stability, which helps the port grow economically. Again, they also spend a lot of money, and they're assisted in doing that, the garrison themselves, in a favorable exchange rate, which is sort of arranged and managed by the Japanese side, and gives them much more purchasing power than they would have in other places. So again, another reason why this is a popular place to be for some. Again, it generates demand, the presence there, the military forces need certain things that it's easy to provide and procure inside of Japan, so this stimulates demand for certain products. So other things they do while they're there, a lot of training, which you may think, well, soldiers train all the time. That's not really the case for 19th century troops. They don't train that often. Again, there's certain records from, I think, certain regiments in the United Kingdom where there's very little training going on over the course of a year. So, like maybe certain units firing maybe 300 rounds of ammunition over the course of a year. That's not the case with these units. They are drilled extensively, every single day at certain times, again, firing, battalion marches down the Tokaido, which is one of the most important road in Japan at this stage, as a kind of a demonstrative force kind of presence exercise. Again, they are used, and again, they expect to be used potentially as well in future. So the level of training sort of supports that. They feel they're in a kind of active area that it's likely we're going to have to go into action soon, so best get practiced. Another influence of the drill and training they do is actually upon the Japanese. So this has been played down, and a lot more attention has been paid to particularly kind of French military influence on particularly the development of the Imperial Japanese Army, and also influences on the shogunal forces beforehand. But the indirect influence, at least, of the British presence, the British troops, I would argue is also significant and has been kind of undervalued to date. So interestingly, the British troops were actually the first choice to be the kind of instructors for the new imperial military. Sorry, it's Bakufu, I'm sorry, the shogunal military, but because of mistakes in terms of contract arrangement, it makes it impossible to do this. They kind of offer them something and then offer it to the French, and the French agree before the British actually get back. So they kind of outmaneuvered, or mistakes are made. So Britain focuses more on the kind of naval side of training. Although again, members of the garrison do go into that. So Lieutenant Hawes, Royal Marine Artillery, goes over and does naval gunnery advice, but he's a member of the actual Marine Garrison in Yokohama. Again, in two of the accounts that we'll look at here, Our Life in Japan and Per Mar Per Terram, there's informal instruction also going on as well. People coming up, Japanese officials coming up and asking for instruction, paying for instruction, and other things from members of the garrison in terms of drill and such. Again, there's lots of joint parades, even kind of joint exercises, as it were, these sort of sham fights, as they're termed, conducted with Japanese troops guarding Yokohama. So there's also sort of cross influence there. Again, accounts of Satsuma troops using British drill in action in the mid-1860s. There are also kind of translations, some of the earliest drill books that are rendered into Japanese from the West, alongside the Dutch ones, of course. Modern drill books, that is in 1860s-ish, are actually ones from British drill. So, the direct training of Japanese formations isn't necessarily going on to the same level the French are doing it. But earlier on, there are major indirect influences here of drill making its way over, and these informal contacts, etc. So sovereignty. Hora is very critical of the presence of these troops, and says that feelings are the same at the time, but this is quite questionable, to be honest, when you look at the evidence. The presence of the garrison, again, to kind of modernize and thinking about sovereignty and other things, thinks very imperialistic. These guys are present, they're influencing the Japanese government, they're occupying this space and such. A lot of the evidence suggests that the shogunate doesn't really view them so much as so much of a problem, and as so much a kind of a violation of their sovereignty. The kind of concept, the modern or Western concept of sovereignty, isn't quite having that much purchase yet inside of Japanese society, or inside of Japanese governmental or shogunal governmental position. Again, it doesn't have a monopoly on armed force. It's not seen as something necessarily as an issue. Like all these other, daimyo lords have their own military forces. The foreigners have some. It's not seen as like kind of puncturing or destroying our sovereignty. Again, it's not a modern state. I mean, these terms are somewhat debated, of course, but you can say early modern or pre-modern state, not state, early modern or pre-modern political organization. Again, as I mentioned before, the shogunate is somewhat supportive in a sense. It constructs the barracks, it it's glad of the kind of help, in a sense, to protect the settlement. And as I've also said, it's useful versus internal rivals. So it's a deterrent from others attacking the foreigners and potentially triggering war, which the shogunate could get drawn into. Again, their presence helps to basically render the expulsionist moves by hardline elements impossible. Okay, you can't do this now because you've got military protection of the settlement or the most important treaty port. That said, for others, including many foreigners, the presence of foreign troops is an indication of the failure of shogunal policy, and even the shogunate itself in terms of its legitimacy or claims to certainly provide security and look after the foreigners as it's meant to do under the treaties. It can't keep its international commitments, so hence we're having to have troops here to look after ourselves because you can't guarantee our safety and security. As Japan learns from the West, or is made to learn from the West, the issue of sovereignty becomes a bit more important. Okay, Japan is deliberately trying to adopt and take on influences from outside, and it wants to be respected and wants to be treated like as an equal. So it has to demand equality, in a sense, in this form too. We don't want foreign troops in our territory. We want to be sovereign domestically and, of course, internationally. So treaty revision is a big thing that the Meiji government is pursuing with its central foreign policy concern, to make treaties between it and the foreign powers more equal. And this is one of the points of inequality that they highlight and work on. Again, raised by Iwakura on his mission around the world when he comes to visit the United Kingdom over when are you going to leave, basically, or when are the troops going to leave. So leisure and cultural influences. Next, again here the images of the Yokohama racecourse, wood block print of such. So you might say maybe some of the most lasting influences, if you want to interpret it in that way, of this force are cultural or leisure related. So of course there's periods of instability and action and drill and patrolling and looking after the settlement and all these other things, but there's also an awful lot of free time for the men and the officers. And again, a central feature of life in, well, several central features of life, drink and such like that, but another central feature of life in the Victorian military, and again, I suppose the British Army still to this day, is sport. And the garrison are the main practitioners and maybe the kind of introducers of various different cultural activities, including different sports. So they form the kind of backbone of lots of the social sphere of life in the treaty port, the social life of the foreign community in the treaty port. So the bands provide the music for virtually all public events. Again, they provide the kind of administration and most of the competitors for most of the athletic and other sporting events. They have rugby matches, cricket matches, go fox hunting around the settlement. Again, they help to establish the sort of shooting club, Yokohama Shooting Club, again, which lots of the foreign community are also members of. Again, the music, as I said, is there. They play on the bandstand, they play at funerals and other events. A very significant legacy of this is one of the bandmasters of it's the 9th Regiment, is hired by the Imperial Japanese government to write the anthem, the national anthem. The original musical score to Kimi ga Yo is produced by Fenton, who is Anglo-Irish bandmaster of the 9th Regiment. He also writes interestingly, the national anthem for Imperial Korea, which of course falls at the hands of Imperial Japan not too long afterwards. So yeah, again, hunting is a major thing they do, and then becomes something of an issue over where they're going and what they're shooting. But yeah, around the environs of the treaty port, they're heavily involved in such. Again, large amount of garrison theatre going on. a lot of the kind of first Western style theatrical productions are those done by members of the garrison and also members of the fleet in, temporarily or more permanently in the case of the garrison in Yokohama. Again, introduction of religious practices too. So you've got, Anglican churches and others constructed principally for the garrison in the first place, but again, which still exists. So Christ Church in Yokohama is one of these. Again, tourism, again, visiting various spots like Kamakura, etc., from Yokohama, and traveling around inside the country among the tricky ports. They can't really go very far inland, but yeah, this is something they do. Again, shopping, purchasing all these sort of curios and things to take back, importing different, Japanese art objects. And again, eating and drinking, creating demand for beef, and helping to introduce champagne and such like that into the Japanese market. So all things done to alleviate imperial boredom, as it were, but which indirectly result in kind of cultural exchange or some influence on the Japanese population in terms of some of these practices. So withdrawal then. Moves towards withdrawal of the troops are considered ultimately from around 1871. Parkes really varies. The British Minister Parkes varies on his position over withdrawal or retention, depending on the political and stability situation in the country. But ultimately, by the end of 1875, all of the French and British troops have been withdrawn. The foreign community isn't really very happy about that. They miss, of course, the kind of core of their social life, as it were, all these young officers and the music and everything else, the visits to the mess or messes of these various different formations. But again, they also feel they want to have, foreign military protecting their position. 1875, things are a lot more safe and stable than they were in 1864. But still, you've got major internal issues inside of Japan. In 1877, Satsuma Rebellion is, one of the last most, significant rebellions. But 1874, you've got issues in Saitama, various other places. So still somewhat unsettled. Reasons behind the withdrawal. I mean, Morton talks about the cost and health. Daniels more the cost. Sims talks about them being delayed because of rival with the French, as I've mentioned. Again, if we talk about costs, it's not necessarily also the direct cost is something that I would add. The Cardwell reforms of the army mean that purchase of commissions is abolished. But this kind of means that the government has to compensate holders of such, so there's a big cash outlay. Again, the Cardwell reforms also push for the withdrawal of British troops stationed in colonies wherever possible. So you get a withdrawal or drawdown of the presence in Canada, for example, and again, this is another place. It's also not really even now so much of an active theatre, of course, not in Japan, but again, one of the reasons the troops are retained in Japan is for use in China, and that's also itself stabilized by the 1870s. So no, not so much a need to keep them here, and we need to save some money, so let's bring them home or move them elsewhere. So into a bit more detail on these participants' accounts that I'll give you some highlights from. Different, slightly differing points during this era of presence, about 11-ish years of the garrison, and this influences to an extent the content of what they talk about. Points and silver are both from the Royal Marine Light Infantry, present between May 64 and August 65. Again, the Royal Marine Light Infantry returns in between 71 and 75, but both of these accounts from them come from the earlier period. Points as a major, again, later Chief Constable of Nottingham and Essex, becomes a policeman after he leaves the Marines. His is more operational, administrative, It's the only one that really is cited anymore, but only because it gives quite high level of detail on the sort of Shimonoseki campaign, because he's involved in the landings and fighting around Shimonoseki. Again, very pro-Japanese. Only a chunk of the work is actually about Japan. You know, his account is sort of his whole career basically in the Marines around the world. Silver, Lieutenant in the Royal Marines Light Infantry. His book is really almost like a collection of images more than it is I mean, there are about 50 pages of text in it, but there's lots and lots of color plates. Again, Blomberg in an edited collection which features this talks about the images themselves being the only really valuable thing in there. This again focuses very heavily on customs of Japan, again, as the title suggests, sketches of Japanese manners and customs. Yeah, it's, I suppose, of some value, but as we'll see later, a lot of these accounts perhaps sometimes more useful in telling us things about the people who produced them rather than what they're talking about sometimes. So the other accounts we'll talk about here, Blundell, a relatively new lieutenant in the 67th Regiment. His is a private journal. So the other ones that we're dealing with here, Points, Silver, Jepson and Elmhurst, are published works, they're books. Blundell's is, yeah, private, I know, journal kept, you know, the diary effectively kept day to day, or more or less day, not every day, but more or less day to day, of his experiences in the early part of his career in the 67th Regiment. Again, he's there during the Shimonoseki campaign. He doesn't, the Marines go in their 67th Regiment and the Bellucci stay in Yokohama. But he's there during the Shimonoseki campaign and the days preceding that, time preceding that. He's there during the Baldwin and Byrd murders, which are two British officers who were killed in an attack by expulsionist individuals. Again, he talks about the usage of the troops to help quell disorder in the settlement. Again, talks about various other things like the usage in protection. Again, he talks about some of the kind of other things that printed Victorian works won't. So visits to, should we say, adult entertainment venues, etc., as we will talk about in a minute. So a very valuable, very interesting source. And again, there's something of a juxtaposition from the content of the others. The last one, Jepson and Elmhurst, Our Life in Japan. Again, both lieutenants in the 9th Regiment. 1866 to 68 is when they're present in the country. It's later on, it's a lot more settled and peaceful. So basically, as I'll talk about later, their account is kind of our boozy and horsey life in Japan. Again, they kind of frame it in like they're telling stories to one another. The way they lay out the book is they're talking on it or reminiscing on a ship's voyage back to England about the fun they had in Japan. But yeah, very heavily focused on leisure. So between these 4 accounts, we get different views of the garrison in different eras over such. The green part, by the way, on this, you can see the different ones coloured in here, is a period of, well, major contagious diseases, cholera and smallpox in the settlement at this time. Again, Blundell himself is very ill when he leaves, and there's cases of smallpox on the vessel he's in as he goes, which, due to the incubation times and things, probably came from Japan, but yeah, that's a separate story. So themes in the accounts, obviously they differ in time and they differ in, how should we say, how public they are, maybe in extension how honest they are about certain things, but there are kind of a series of things that are held in common between them. So operations points, talking about, as I said, Shimonoseki, Blundell, the defences of Yokohama, and the Shimonoseki campaign from a different location. Again, the ceremony, the drill, the official duties, again, lots of commentary. Again, this is another kind of theme in imperial scholarship these days about landscape. Again, leisure time, very major. As I said, it's like the core of Jepsen and Elmhurst. Again, tourism, their visits to Kamakura. Again, internal movements with ships moving between Yokohama and Nagasaki and Kobe and stuff. Again, of course, they all contain commentary on Japan and on the Japanese people. And within that, they contain, of course, sort of social Darwinist or imperial tropes of warrior races and a sporting nation, which we'll come to. So I'm going to focus on the three underlined here. If you have any questions or such about the others, I can very happy to answer those in the later stages of this event. So leisure time, as I said, varies a bit in era. Again, very similar practices these guys are doing all over the world. It doesn't matter where they are. Drinking, socializing, hunting, both fox hunting or hunting on horseback, or hunting with birds and such with guns. Again, lots of sport: cricket, football, skating, rugby, all these various other things. Again, other creative diversions. So regimental journals. Again, writing kind of frivolous sketches and other things in sort of shared books, like these regimental works, one of which emerges here in the 9th Regiment, the Fusiyama, corruption of Fujiyama cabinet, it's termed. Again, hunting itself, John M. Mackenzie talks about this in kind of the imperial context as a source of display and symbolic dominance of the environment. Again, racial inequalities that exist between Europeans and local hunters, denial of game, natural history and conservation, all being kind of tied in with the imperial project. Issue here is that the locals aren't really interested in the things that are being hunted for game. They don't eat them, but there are diplomatic incidents over kind of crop damage or people hunting outside of the permitted range, or incidents with local farmers and such of hedges and such being destroyed. But yeah, it's not like they're depriving the locals of food because they're not eating these game birds, and are not really fussed about foxes. Not that they would eat them, of course, in the first place. Again, there's some evidence, Jepsen and Elmhurst, of particularly of people trying Japanese sports. So there's sort of some sumo wrestlers are paid to come and visit the garrison, and they wrestle some of the men. Again, some of them practice, it's like, what is it called? Single stick type of fencing with the Japanese guards of Yokohama. Again, Jepsen and Elmhurst sort of take part in kite flying and such with local people. But yeah, horse riding, twice a day sometimes for Jepsen and Elmhurst, again, just around the settlement, or involving fox hunting or others, or again, day trips, as it were, down to Kamakura or other places within the 8-mile or so limit. There are other forms of ledger, though, which don't find their way into the published accounts. So I said Blundell here is very, very useful. He notes down matters that are not really for public consumption and don't feature, as I said, in other accounts. So talking about prostitution, talking about going to the sort of large government-sanctioned brothel and watching a kind of adult entertainment performance, shall we say. And again, details the kind of violence and, rapidly escalating issues that can develop between drunk foreigners, of course, who don't speak any Japanese, and locals. So he gives this account of French Marines being murdered by a mob inside the settlement, and then the French troops and British troops being deployed to kind of stabilize the situation, charging the Japanese civilians in the street and clearing the streets. So you don't see any of this in other accounts, even highly regarded primary accounts like Journal of Hall and various others. No commentary about such things. So sort of seedier, more violent, exploitative side gets a bit more play in Blundell. Again, the views of the Japanese, typically the content of these accounts is Orientalist, of course, and paternalistic. But interestingly, they're almost universally positive, with the exception of Blundell, about the Japanese. I mean, there's certainly, horrible instances of content racism and anti-Semitism inside some of them. It's some sort of foolish characters inside of Jepson and Elmhurst who particularly get cited for using this sort of language. But yes, strangely and interestingly, they are very positive in terms of their view of the Japanese, but they don't really mix very much with the Japanese, which maybe sort of had some caveats over this. And where they do, it's like as a customer buying things. Again, sometimes on official visits or such. They certainly don't socialize with them in their messes. They don't, meet them outside of normally any official duties. Yeah, they don't speak Japanese except for maybe a few very simple mispronounced phrases. And Japan, the Japanese are more kind of, especially in Jepson and Elmhurst, more like almost like a backdrop. Our boozy and horsey adventures, quote unquote, in Japan, is more the theme there. So as I said, Blundell differs, and again, maybe he's slightly more candid of feelings at the time during the Shimonoseki campaign and the Baldwin and Byrd murders and such, very high, tense, violent period, that he says, basically, I don't mind leaving Japan. It's a very nice and beautiful place, except for the Japanese. Again, having to walk around, as even Jepson and Elmhurst still have to in the later period, armed at all times. He says, yeah, as it says here, a nuisance. But yeah, others seem to have relatively cordial relations and seem to have, as I said, a positive image. As I mentioned, the sort of social Darwinist positions or tropes of warrior races are central, and in certain cases related back to European history. Also, the taste for sport is highlighted, or observed, or seemingly observed amongst the Japanese population by these officers. Again, central to their lives, so it's the kind of thing they pay attention to. So typically, yeah, the Japanese are positively compared to other nationalities. In particular, they're often military related or physical aspects are praised. Again, as I said, influenced by the military nature of the observers and links to social Darwinistic tropes, and also their again, their very high interest in sport. They're looking out and seeing things through these eyes. Again, we've got some quotes here from various different accounts. I'm not sure I'm going to read them out because I want to save time. But again, generally positive. I've cut this down. Several more slides of detail on these, but yeah, comparison to old Romans and Spartans, and again, few nations have more rational enjoyment than they have. Very fond of sports of various kinds. A military nation. There's also a high degree of interest in executions and ritual suicide. So sometimes the garrison is asked to attend or made to attend or wants to attend, especially if they're going to the execution of those being punished, as it were, for killing some of their own. But like the account of Sato and various others, those observing express admiration often for the conduct of those being executed, even when they've killed their fellow officers or British subjects. So yeah, to skip straight to the end of this one, one could not help grieving for such a truly gallant fellow, so loyal to his nation and his own convictions. So to conclude anyway, clearly I think this topic, this garrison, is worthy of greater attention than it's had to date. Again, the merchants, the diplomats have got, gallons of ink, used or employed over their exploits and all the different minutiae of their activities. Whereas this group, which formed, as I said, at certain times 5 times their number, has virtually zero attention. Again, looking at them adds another facet to studies of the British imperial experience in Asia, of this sort of early Meiji, late Bakumatsu era Anglo-Japanese relations. Again, taking into account the size of the force, the insecurity, the level of violence, again, the fact that trading isn't really fully established or doing so well. As I argue here, it might be more accurate to describe the treaty port, especially in the early years, as a kind of tense and occasionally violent imperial military cantonment rather than a sort of flourishing cosmopolitan trading post that it arguably becomes, and is portrayed as in much of the literature, but isn't really at this point. Again, as I said, the military character here of the viewpoints presented, especially the viewpoints that are published, maybe has an influence on views of Japan from outside when these accounts come out. Again, the accounts that we're looking at here, so Silver, Jepson and Elmhurst are very early. Points is a bit later, but they all relate to and cover a very, very early period. And you could argue that, well, as I already have, they add certain extra elements, extra viewpoints of the treaty port period, and ones which haven't been examined. So the cultural legacies, the cultural impact, both direct and indirect, of the force, I would say, is relatively significant. And again, some of the images are of a relatively pleasant stay, at least in the published accounts, are transmitted back home, along with the way that the members of the garrison, or some of them, frame their views of the Japanese. So as a sort of warrior race, as a sporting nation. Orientalist, again, social Darwinistic characterizations, but ones, interestingly, especially on the warrior race side of things, which are taken and employed by the Japanese themselves to help further their position in the kind of imperial hierarchy, as it were. So, of course, there are discrepancies in the accounts. I mean, most notably, of course, between the published and unpublished versions. And again, differing nature between the accounts from different times. So the earlier, more violent periods, the later, more peaceful ones. But yeah, it certainly can be argued that the images of Japan presented potentially contribute to some of the discourse and narrative around, how should we say, international images of Japan, emerging as it emerges as a modern state. Okay, so thank you very much. That concludes the main presentation. Very happy to hear comments and questions, and of course hear from Professor Aldous in his discussion comments. So thanks very much.
Chris, could you like to take the charge?
Sure, thank you, Tom. That was fascinating, and it illuminated a topic of great interest that hasn't attracted, as you said, hasn't attracted much scholarship at all. There's a period of 10 years really that we're talking about, a decade, and a few themes sort of stood out for me. This is an incredibly important period of Japanese history. It's a period of transition from the late Tokugawa shogunate, which of course falls in 1868, and the beginning of a period of rapid change for Japan when a new ruling oligarchy rule in the name of the emperor after the Meiji restoration of 1868. And these troops are witness to these major changes. That was one of the themes that stood out. It is a period of great turmoil, isn't it? This period from the mid-1860s to the mid-1870s. Also, you were talking about ideas around sovereignty and international relations, and the degree to which the Tokugawa shogunate, which loses power in 1868, doesn't really engage with these issues because it's so vulnerable itself. It's losing power, and in a sense, the foreign presence just underlines its weakness. But of course, with the new government that comes in 1868, they're a very quick study in terms of engaging with ideas of sovereignty and international relations. And they quickly learn how to conduct modern diplomatic relations because they're so determined, of course, to end the system of unequal treaties, which of course is what's brought in the whole system of treaty ports. So the third theme I wanted to, maybe this one is more of a question actually, is of course Japan becomes part of a network of treaty ports in East Asia, and of course the contrast that's always drawn, and you alluded to this, is between Japan and China. But I wonder if the contrast is actually it becomes stark later, but at this time I would have thought the similarities between treaty ports in China and treaty ports in Japan are probably, the similarities are more striking than the differences, and I wondered if you had any more comments about that. The fourth theme, really interesting, these social and cultural interactions that again you alluded to in terms of the contacts between these troops and Japanese. I'm just trying to get my head around fox hunting in the late 1860s, early 1870s in Japan. I certainly didn't know that British troops went fox hunting in Japan, and obviously they must have had some significant social interactions if they were doing those kinds of things, not to mention interactions through some of the issues that Blundell raises around prostitution, and I wondered whether some of those interactions end in serious conflicts, as a result of which foreigners are tried and convicted in, well, British troops are tried and convicted in British consular courts, because of course after 1858 one of the privileges that foreign communities have is this privilege of extraterritoriality. They can commit crimes against Japanese, but they're not tried under the Japanese system. They're tried in foreign courts. I wondered if you'd come across any crimes that were committed as a result of these interactions with the Japanese population. And the last theme, which you kind of discussed a bit at the end, which I think again is really interesting, is the kind of longer term significance of all of this. This is 10 years. And of course, you talked about British respect for Japan as a kind of warrior race, a kind of positive image. I mean, not shared by everyone, but shared by most of them. Positive image of the Japanese as sort of gallant and brave, and having the kind of qualities and values that seem attractive to many British people or many British troops at this time. And I wondered if this encounter that you've told us about, that you've illuminated, whether you can see this as part of a process of a kind of cultural affinity between Britain and Japan that you can then see leading to the Anglo-Japanese Treaty of 1902 to 1922, whether you see this early encounter. I mean, obviously many things happen between this and that treaty being signed in 1902, but whether you see this as part of this process whereby the beginning of a process whereby there is this cultural affinity between these two nations that leads to an alliance in the early 20th century. So those are my main points stroke questions that I'd welcome any comments on.
Thank you very much. Yeah. So I suppose I'll deal with them in order. I mean, the Japan versus China treaty ports at this time, yeah, it's very much kind of interconnected. So you've got people popping over between particularly Shanghai and Yokohama quite regularly. So in the accounts, they're talking about people go over to do some shooting in Shanghai and come back, or back and forth. Or one goes over and buys a horse in Shanghai and brings it back. Again, part of the kind of sort of informal-ish tourism. They go and visit one another. In terms of commonalities, I mean, of course, during the earlier parts of this, it's the sort of Taiping Rebellion is raging in China, and the troops are kept in Japan as obviously for potential use and protection of the treaty port in Japan, but also it's there kind of in reserve for use in China if we need to. And these units, like Blundell is actually involved fighting again in the Taiping Rebellion before his unit is moved to such. again, they often refer to the conditions, as I said, in Japan being much better than that in Shanghai in particular. Although, again, the conditions that he finds when he eventually gets to Hong Kong, the barracks is in there, he really likes them. They're sort of the best he's ever seen, he says. But yeah, relatively similar. Again, there's sort of attacks on foreigners in obviously Canton and in Shanghai. You've got military presence in Shanghai, kind of garrison there. Again, a sort of limited zone that they kind of police or have, formalized access to. They have sort of exclusion rules, don't they, about no either Imperial Chinese troops or Taipings can approach within, I think it's 8 miles or so of Shanghai. So you've got, the British troops, but also, Gordon's so-called ever victorious army and others patrolling inside of that space. But yeah, they see a lot of similarities, but as I said, maybe this contributes to the favorable image. They often, compare Japanese people, favorably to the Chinese. Again, maybe because they've been fighting in China for a long time and have developed, certainly it's normally almost always racist ideas about such, but yeah. And the fact that things are a bit more settled and peaceful still, not really fully peaceful or settled in Japan, maybe adds to some of that positive image. Yeah, the consular court side of things, yeah, in Blundell, again, he talks about one of his fellow officers and some naval officers getting into a kind of fist fight with the locals over some lanterns. I think they smash the lanterns they're carrying and it generates into like a brawl. And they get hauled up in front of the consular court over that. I assume they get a slap on the wrist because they leave not so long afterwards. But you obviously got the consular courts there, the extraterritorial privileges there, the British consular court. But also you have these guys are subject to martial, sort of a military discipline as well. So they'll go in front of a court martial, or the men will anyway, for things. And again, I've got hold of, I haven't unfortunately had time to look at them in detail before this presentation, but the court-martial records for the Japan Battalion. So that's another element that, of the scholarship and the larger book project that this will probably come to of where I'll look at this. Yeah, the cultural affinity one. Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I mean, obviously, how should we say this? Like Japan, if you think about like Inazo Nitobe and Bushido and these other kind of accounts where it sort of twists on purpose. I mean, it's written first of all in English for an English-speaking audience and twists like Japanese history to fit knightly values, right? There's a kind of almost conscious process going on of Japan, not just diplomatically and in terms of technology and other things, but adjusting and modeling parts of its certainly self-image, but also international image to match expectations of the West. A lot of this is to help overcome the unequal treaties and, as Ravina puts it, join the nations of the world, right? So how should we say, there's elements of playing up to this, but a lot of it becomes kind of internalized. Like, if you think about Edo period Japan, the samurai make up maybe 20%-ish of the population. It's not, a vast amount. And most of them don't have any, none of them have any really combat experience at all. They're all administrators. And many idle, or they take piecework on and they guard a gate of the castle for, 10 days a month or something. They're much more kind of artists, or not artists, or playboys, artists, administrators, principally, rather than warriors anymore. But the entire society is remade to kind of fit some of these social Darwinist positions of a warrior race, and it's not noble savages, but a non-Western way to get respect in this sort of imperial hierarchy is to go down this route and play the game, if we Newbolt, right? Play up to Britain and play the game, as it were, here. And it fits. I mean, obviously, there's other reasons for affinity and connections. And United Kingdom does its best to be heavily involved centrally in the development of Japan, especially in this era, 1860s into the 1880s. It's really central. I mean, Perry's of course influential at the start, but it's really Britain after that. And strategically, again, that connects to this too. The garrison is one of the reasons it's there. Some say is to counterweight Russian moves elsewhere. And the affinity here is Japan has got potential problems with Imperial Russia, and so does Britain. So we have sort of strategic reasons to team up. We've got, again, a kind of cultural adaptation. We've got maybe some positive legacies, positive images from this time, and then they all help. I mean, I think it's a relatively minor strain. I mean, there are other ones that are a bit more major. Some of the kind of, naval missions and other things later have a bit more play, and the guys involved have a bit more say in, or a bit more influence to an extent in the process towards the Anglo-Japanese alliance. But maybe this is the start, or one of the starts of this. So, yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, Chris, you have to unmute if you want to say something.
Sorry, yeah. Thank you, Tom. You did answer my question. I was just saying that I'm sure there are other questions, so I'll let's hear those.
We don't have any question in the chat area, but if anybody wants to ask a question, they can raise their hand with the sign at the top of the screen, or you can just write something in the chat area. I cannot see any hand raised at the moment. Let's give it a moment, because with all the technical issues that we had, I'll just going to write something in the chat area to be sure that it's working. So. It seems to be working. So.
Okay, good. Well, maybe I can have another one then.
Yes.
Shall I have another one? Okay, I wanted to ask you about hunting, because I've done some work on the, the US hunting in Japan after the end of the Second World War, and the US-led occupation at that time. Now, I was struck by the fact that you said it didn't seem to bother the locals, but I just wondered, I mean, soldiers, it's one of their favorite leisure activities, isn't it, to go hunting? I wondered, apart from foxes, what else are they hunting that, I mean, I would have thought if they're hunting game birds, that's going to annoy the locals. If they're hunting game more generally, that might annoy the locals. I mean, have you come across much about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's big chunks of particularly Jepson and Elmhurst where they're talking about going off and hunting is like pheasants and golden pheasants and things like that. Again, they've got this like pack of dogs that they bring in over time, or acquire, which they use for the fox hunting, and they also use the same dogs for some of them anyway for hunting with the guns. I mean, again, they employ also kind of Japanese bearers for all kinds of things, but like kind of bearers or beaters in this case, they sort of send them off into thickets and do this. But I mean, they're not, I suppose, I say they didn't bother locals too much, as in it doesn't really generate directly diplomatic incidents, but they're not asking for permission.
No.
So you can probably, the locals probably are irritated, to be honest, but there's no, in the accounts, they don't mention the local farmers, but I suppose they're not, it's not maybe a very wise or rational idea to go up to a number of armed foreigners and try and tell them to get off their land in a language they don't understand. But yeah, they're heavily involved. I mean, obviously they are limited in terms of their access into the interior. They have a certain range.
A certain distance, is it?
Yeah, I think if I recall, I think I said 8 miles or so, but they can't go beyond that. They're not allowed to do that. But within that space, they kind of not eliminate the game bird population, but are heavily involved in hunting those. There's an interesting account too when they go down to visit. I can't remember whether it's the daimyo of Satsuma, but the officers that go down, they give him like a modern shotgun, and he's delighted with it because that's one of his favorite things to do is go and hunt. So there's a kind of bonding over hunting game with some of the kind of higher ranked samurai who they interact with. But yeah, it's like, when they're off the fox hunting and they talk about jumping all these hedges and, crashing, falling off their horses and stuff in paddy fields and what have we. it's all regaled as a kind of jolly and adventurous experience, but yeah, the unspoken maybe irritation of the rice crops being destroyed and damaged by the peasants is absent. So as I said, maybe I should have been a bit clearer that the irritation is not recorded, but it's likely to have occurred, I think.
Sure.
Yeah. Oh,
Right, I cannot see it. We have a hand. Yes, we have a hand. Chucky, and Richard too. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yes.
Okay. I just wondered whether or not there were any European women around in the settlements in the garrisons at this time. You haven't mentioned any at all, and I kind of assumed there probably wasn't any to put any balance whatsoever into this incredibly macho environment that they had there.
There's not many, to be honest. Later on, there are more. Harry Parkes has his wife over, and he kind of actually uses her in a sense as a kind of diplomatic aid to himself, and to sort of takes him with him on all these missions to see all these very senior Japanese, as a kind of demonstrating how, well, I don't know, I mean, from his perspective, he's trying to sort of demonstrate the quote unquote superiority of Western society versus the Japanese, again, imperialistic imposition of such. But yeah, the female foreign population is very low indeed. I would say single digits, but very, very small. Again, the suffering of a lot of the wives, and again families of the men of these regiments is sort of noted in a lot of the history of the British Army at this time, because there's a certain number, I think it's 10% or so, that are allowed to travel, and that was done by lottery, and the rest are left basically destitute until these guys return, if they ever return, and that could be 10 years later. So the women and the kids are left behind. I mean, later on the regiments start to provide like schooling and other things for the children, but yeah, it really is a sort of institutionally, you might say, misogynistic environment in multiple ways. But yeah, it's well noted in a lot of the social histories of the British Army, the sort of terrible conditions that the women are forced into.
Okay, thank you.
So, yeah.
Graciela, your microphone's not on. Your
sorry,
turn.
sorry. I was just saying that Richard has a question. So if you would like to unmute Richard and pose your question. Or you like to write it in the chat? Can you hear us, Richard? Or have you decided not to put a question anymore?
There he is.
Oh, there we are, Richard. That's it. We can hear you now, hopefully. Oh, no, we cannot hear you. You're still muted. Something is happening. You are still muted. No. Can you write the question in the chat area?
I'm not sure I can see the chat.
I can see the chat, but I cannot see anything here written, but it may be because he didn't send it.
maybe while we're waiting, Tom, can I ask you about the other treaty ports? Have you come across anything in relation to Kobe?
Kobe. In connection to this, they're not obviously stationed anywhere other than Yokohama. I think we've got some feedback here, haven't we? We've got some sound. But they are brought on land when Kobe is open, Hyogo is open. And they're actually, as I said, there's this action is involved when the diplomats landing get attacked.
Are you getting an echo by chance? Yes, I think it's because, Richard, there's a problem with your computer. So we are hearing our voices echoing from your computer. So funny thing, I have to ask you now to mute yourself.
I think it's
okay,
done, yeah.
that's it. So now the echo is gone.
Yeah, I was just saying, yeah, they get brought on land. They're offshore when Hyogo is open. There's a ceremony to open it, and then at that time there's this incident, the Kobe incident, as it's termed, and they're brought on. You know, these troops. An incident happens where this American sailor kind of crosses through a column of Japanese soldiers moving through Hyogo, and he gets attacked, and another person with him get attacked, and they run off down to the port. And these Japanese troops follow them, and then they get to where the foreign diplomats and others are there, in the nascent treaty port buildings, and they kind of fire a volley at them, and the foreign presence will sort of hide themselves there, but then the Marines are brought on shore from the garrison, and them and Parks gets on horseback, sort of imperial adventurous, and chases these guys off into the hills. So they're involved there, but they don't really visit Hyogo any time really other than that. I think that's the only time they're present. I mean, there'll probably be some visits later on of guys kind of moving up to see it on tourism basis or other things, but they're never stationed there.
Okay, so the only garrison is at Yokohama.
That's it, yeah. Both them and the French, yeah. I mean, there's obviously guys moving, sailors and such moving on and offshore in all the treaty ports all the time. But yeah, the only permanent, quote unquote, permanent presence is in Yokohama.
Yeah, I think I got the question from Richard. I think the problem, Richard, is that you are still for some reason in the previous room. But I can see from the chat area, it says, many Victorian museums acquire ethnographic collections, which created images of other nations. Is there any evidence of what members of the garrison brought home to represent where they have been, reflecting their image of Japan?
Very interesting question. Thank you. What they brought back, again, some of them, they buy things and then sell them on, like they take them to Shanghai and sell them, or they get stuff from Shanghai and sell it in Japan, making money off cabinets and stuff. One of them buys a very expensive cabinet or in which one it is and sells it off for the other for money. In terms of things they bring back, I mean, the British troops bring back all the cannon, or most of the cannon from Shimonoseki, and some of them are still displayed outside of I think it's in Portsmouth somewhere, maybe outside of former Royal Marine Barracks, like the bronze cannon. In terms of items, and there's an awful lot, as I said, of shopping going on, people purchasing things. Again, a previous similar presentation I did on this topic, I had a similar question about the influence on the kind of Japonism or Japonisme, my French pronunciation, forgive me, of such ideas or things coming over. Again, it's something that I like to look into in a bit more detail, the items they bring back, but I think a lot of it's kind of cheap, especially amongst the men, like, I'm going to say tat, but small, inexpensive souvenirs that probably haven't survived down to the present. But yeah, I mean, Parks and others, they acquire high quality things like screens and other items, swords and all this sort of stuff. So yeah, that's an interesting angle I haven't really thought too much about so far. And thank you very much for the question, because it's one I'd certainly like to look into. What's the kind of the provenance of some of this stuff that's brought back? Again, as you know, the guy's name escapes me now, but one of the individuals is quite a well-off a lord, and he brings back, as I said, this drill book, but I'm almost certain he would have brought back some other more expensive souvenirs. Again, the Prince of is it Prince of Wales visits, and they have to guard him during this time. He's the first first British royal to visit Japan, and he takes back a load of stuff, crated up. So I'm sure that's still about. But what it is and how it influences the image, it'll be interesting. I'm sure there's an awful lot of arms and armor in there. It's probably swords and suits of armor and stuff, which again contributes to this, you know, military caste, military country, military image, etc. But yeah, thank you very much. Excellent question.
We have a question from Jake, and I think this will be the last question because we are already at past 1. So Jake Smith, can you please unmute yourself?
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I want to say, first I want to say thank you, Thomas, for the talk. It was very insightful. And I also wanted to ask, after learning about the Iwakura missions, there were points around the difference between gender roles and opinions on things like familial piety between Japan and the West. I was wondering, with the French and British troops stationed, whether any kind of, I guess, culture shocks or differences between those two periods were evident.
Do you mean between the two garrisons or over those two issues, like filial piety and what was the other one? Sorry, gender roles.
Gender roles, yeah. So I guess Western views on what the East, how they acted towards their family, for example, or how husband and wife would treat one another, and whether or not they saw that, and then if they did, how they reacted.
How should we say this? Yeah, I mean, they're again quite positive over the family structures that they see. Again, as I said, they're not reacting that much. I mean, one of the things that they're quite surprised about is the kind of differences over, how should we say, body image. I don't know whether that's the right word. Like, they're talking about how they don't believe the Japanese have any modesty at all. And they're all naked together in the bath and bathing on the street outside and all these various other things that, you know, Victorian individuals might find somewhat difficult to digest. But they certainly make commentary on that. Again, in terms of familial relations, I mean, they're not really directly involved in dealing with families, as it were. Gender roles. Again, they make commentary about how people greet one another and talk in the streets and such. I mean, again, I remember sort of accounts from Hall and such talking about how he was kind of really, how should we say, put off. I mean, generally speaking, his account's relatively positive, but of the way that Japanese family were dealing with death of children and things like that, he said to his eyes it seemed like they were callous and such. So there are certainly observed differences, and big chunks of some of these accounts really are about, you know, highlighting these kind of very small things that, you know, social relations or how people bow and all this sort of, you know, very surface level stuff. But these individuals, as I said, the garrison members don't really interact with Japanese people that much. Certainly don't really converse with them and go into detail over family structures and things like that. It just doesn't really occur. Again, of course, they note obviously the concubinage and, you know, the various daimyo having all of these sort of train of females and all these other things. But you know, surprisingly, I mean, they're not sort of moralizing over such. But again, these are, you know, Victorian soldiers, so they're, how should we say, moral on maybe there's a sort of surface public face. Again, you see in the documents, right? We don't talk about these things. Everything's very jolly and such, but behind the scenes, you know, regularly involved in prostitution, or, you know, all these various other things that we don't talk about. It's like a private life and public image. But basically, as I said, yeah, I haven't encountered too much commentary about such, other than kind of surface level views of the family and how women do certain jobs, like that he didn't see so much potentially in in the West, involved in work in certain things, but yeah, not so much on that. But again, another angle that might be interesting to kind of drill down into in these documents. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Well, I think we could try at least to give a big applause to Thomas for a wonderful talk. And you can use the electronic or unmute and say thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for the patience, and apologies for all the technical issues, but we succeeded, and you have a very good attendance, Thomas, so that we're very pleased. And we hope that you continue following the Modern History Research Center in the activities that we're going to have in semester 2, and hopefully we are going to have details on that in the coming weeks, and we'll keep you informed. So thank you very much, and we look forward to see you again at some stage, perhaps in the flesh here in the UK. That would be great.
Looking forward to it. Thank you.
Tom.
Cheers. Yeah, thanks, Chris. And yeah, I see Colin was there, Natalia and everybody else. So yeah, Natsukashi. All right. Thank you very much anyway. Look forward to next time.
Thank you. All the best.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.